Hi, Steve.
Hi, Bob. Good to see you.
How are you doing? Good to see you.
I'm doing fine.
Good to see that we're both wearing the same kind of what do they call it?
You know, that's sweaters? A very handsome ensemble you have on.
Yeah. This is the only thing like this I own, and I only got it recently. I'm not the kind of person to wear one of these.
When you're super stylish, you only need one
Is
thing.
It stylish? So I kind of fear that we would be deluding ourselves to think it's stylish. It's one of these sweaters with a zipper that only goes down about 8 inches. So you can't, it's a pullover, and yet it has this zipper. I assume it's like an old man thing, but if I'm being stylish, I'd love to find that out.
Nobody has told me it's not stylish, so I'm going to rest on that.
Well, there's probably a lot of things you're doing that people have have not told you the truth about, Steve. Anyway, let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You're Steve Chapman, longtime columnist at the Chicago Tribune. Also, you're on the editorial board? You write editorials that are the voice of the newspaper sometimes? Is that true, too?
That's correct.
And
twice a week, more or less. I write 2 columns and 2 editorials a week.
That's a fair amount, even in today's demanding environment where they expect journalists to work like rats on a treadmill.
It's a superhuman workload that I carry, Bob.
That you carry without complaint. So we're going to talk about media, among other things, at least. The way this started out was I noticed on Twitter that you were trashing not NPR as a whole, but one aspect of NPR. And I thought, hey, it'd be great to have a whole conversation just trashing NPR. But then upon interrogating you via DM, I was somewhat saddened to find out that indeed you didn't feel that NPR as a whole should be burned to the ground. You just had specific issues. And so I thought, well, okay, I'll settle for that.
Burn to the ground? No, not to the ground.
Not to the ground. Just burn halfway.
No, actually, I'm a big fan of NPR, and I have been since before I started at the Tribune, which was a long time ago.
With reservations, and we're gonna talk about the reservations.
We'll talk about the reservations, but I do think what I like about NPR is that they focus on the news. They don't spend all their time on people sitting around arguing, which is what most of the airtime on CNN these days is people offering their opinions about what's going on in the world. There was a time, am I wrong, or was there a time when CNN was much more news oriented than it was sort of commentary and analysis?
You're not wrong at all. When Ted Turner started it, they meant the name Cable News Network. It was just straight up.
And it seemed like half their coverage was Christiana Amanpour in Bosnia describing, whatever carnage was going on there.
I guess. Now, they at some point, I don't think from the very beginning, but they branched into 2 channels. One was Headline News or something?
Headline News, which was like basically a half hour. It's kind of a standard half-hour news show like the evening news on.
Although, have you looked at it lately?
Networks.
Have you looked at Headline News lately?
I have not.
Oh, bears no resemblance. I mean, it's I don't know if it's more tabloidy or what, but it's not. No, do you remember the Headline News anchor woman with the very large eyes? It's not ringing a bell, I can tell. Anyway,
Marsha Leidendorf, I remember.
I'm not sure if that was her name. Anyway. I'm just strolling down memory lane here. Okay, we're going to talk about other stuff too. Maybe the state of the media in a more general sense. Whether the newspaper, you would be an expert on that, being a traditional newspaper guy. We may get into the Houston Astros cheating scandal. Who knows? May get a little into impeachment. But let's start off complaining about NPR.
Well, the tweet that you mentioned was not about NPR. It was about one particular NPR anchor.
Let's get him. Go.
Scott Simon.
The weekend morning edition guy?
Weekend morning edition. He's on Saturday mornings. And as a rule, I listen to NPR morning edition 6 days a week. And on Saturday, I usually don't, because I just find him impossible to bear. And what I find impossible about him is what distinguishes him from everybody else on NPR, which is normally when you're listening to NPR, it doesn't really matter who's talking, which anchor they have. They kind of all blend together. They're not really obtrusive and prominent. I couldn't tell you the difference between Mary Louise Kelly and Rachel Martin. Yeah, Rachel Martin and Louise Kelly. If one of them came on right now, I probably couldn't tell you which it was, even though I would recognize the voices.
Even Scott Simon sounds a little like Robert Siegel, who is perhaps no longer doing All Things Considered, but did for a very long time, if he's not.
Yeah, he did, and Robert Siegel is the one who's sort of a little bit of an exception, but he doesn't bother me to the extent that Simon does. I feel like the Saturday weekend edition is the Scott Simon show. It's not weekend edition. It's all about, you never forget that it's Scott Simon. He never lets you forget that it's him and that he has all these little hobby horses and eccentricities. He never forgets to remind you that he's from Chicago, that he's a Cubs fan.
Oh, he's from Chicago. Now, do we have a local rivalry here?
No, he was gone long before. He was gone long before I got here. So, we're in different.
Did you at one point hope to follow in his footsteps? Use Chicago as a launch pad for an NPR career?
Yeah. I do have a face for radio. But I don't particularly like talking for a living. I'm making an exception for you.
You're doing well so far. Although we would like to hear a little more of how you really feel about Scott Simon. I don't think we've really gotten to the.
Okay. I find his ego to be very pronounced. His personality to be very sort of dramatizing, and he lets himself get in the way of every story. And I think that's a cardinal sin for a journalist.
See, I mean, I'm not an expert on him, and I haven't done a lot of research for this. I hadn't thought of it. There is something that I find a little annoying about him, but I hadn't thought of his ego being obtrusive in as obvious a way as you're suggesting. I had thought it. I think of him as doing like a lot of subtle virtue signaling, a lot of sending signals about what a warm and wonderful and right-minded person he is. You know what I mean? But doing it subtly in terms of like what sensitive questions he asks, and when he gets that kind of dramatic, empathetic tone in his voice, or
he's kind of hammy.
He is subtly hammy. And then when it's time to laugh with the sports guy, he's charmingly.
He has this
so, I don't know.
Laugh that's kind of exaggerated and not very believable.
Pretty good, actually. And
did you know he lived in France? Or he has a French wife, so he makes references to that quite often.
He's the kind who would, isn't he?
Yes, but if you knew he lived in France, you would not fail to pick up on the reminders.
Now I have a possibly larger grievance against NPR, and I think it largely has to do with their foreign policy coverage. I mean, I got to admit, they're in a tough spot. They're like the highbrow national radio thing. They're supposed to act like they don't have an ideology, but they are basically liberal. It's not an easy job, So I would say all that. I would foreground all that. But I listen to the BBC sometimes in the morning. I listen to their news roundup. And the BBC is just so much better. First of all, of course, they're more interested in the world broadly because they're over in Europe where there's a bunch of countries close together, and also they're a legacy in a way of the British Empire. There is an interest in a lot of nations and true world affairs in a true sense, but also they're much better at. It's a much more analytically efficient exercise. The reporting from the BBC. I mean, they really get to the crux of the issues not unfailingly, but at least they get more to the crux that I want to hear about of issues in world affairs than NPR does. And before I actually have a Scott Simon example of this. So you're going to love this. But does any of that resonate with you, or do you have not have views one way or the other?
I don't. I rarely hear the BBC. I mean, they have this partnership with NPR, so it's certain if I'm up early enough or late enough, then I can hear the BBC. But I don't usually get it. What I have noticed on the times that I've listened to it is their interviewers are pretty fierce and challenging whatever the interviewee is saying, and I think I think NPR has learned from that because their interviews have gotten much more. They're much more inclined to challenge the person they're interviewing than they were 10, 15 years ago. And I think the departure of Bob Edwards, I think that was one of the reasons they let him go, because they felt like he didn't interrogate people very vigorously, and he would let them say things and just move on to the next question instead of saying, wait, that's not true, or how do you know that? Or
was he the morning edition guy for a while?
Yeah. And he was the guy he was there for a long time, and they canned him, and it was a big uproar. And I was sorry that they let him go, and then I realized actually they knew what they were doing, because the interviewers now they don't just move on to the next question when they hear something that's questionable. They say, wait a minute.
Yeah, but do they do that in a non-ideological way?
Yes, I think they do.
Okay.
I think if you listen to the morning edition people interview politicians, they will challenge Democrats as well as Republicans. Okay. They'll say, well, this is what so-and-so says. Now, how do you respond to that? I mean, have you accounted for this?
That's all to the good, that is kind of in the BBC tradition.
I think in the choice of stories and sort of not. I don't think sort of their worldview. I think you're right. They are perceptibly liberal, but I don't think they let liberals get away with anything that they don't let conservatives get away with.
Well, on foreign policy, part of my complaint is that they are perceptibly blobbish. They are just, the foreign policy establishment is just feeding them their worldview, and they don't challenge it in the way that at least I think it urgently needs to be challenged. I have an example of that, but my Scott Simon story is a little different. This was just this last Saturday, and it speaks to kind of, I would say, a certain softness in their coverage, a kind of a sacrifice of kind of analytical clarity and kind of coldness for kind of like touchy-feely stuff. And what it was when Iran retaliated for the Soleimani assassination, they fired ballistic missiles from Iran into a base in Iraq where American troops were. The initial reports were no American casualties, so we didn't have to retaliate. And the story seemed to be that Iran had actually very carefully avoided casualties, and in fact, by some accounts, had sent word of the attack so that Americans could evacuate. They certainly did evacuate. They all went into a bomb shelter. So the story was, it turns out there were casualties. Okay. And so people started saying, wow, so we were this close to war, because if one of these people had gotten killed, we probably would have had to bomb Iran, right? And now it turned out that the casualties were all concussions. They were burst concussions. I think some were psychological trauma, but the physical casualties were concussions that just came from the force of the explosions.
Right. Yeah, some of the people on the base were outside for some reason. They had to stay outside the bunker, and I think there were 11 who reported some symptoms of brain injury, and they found that 8 of them had concussions.
I think that's right.
But it took a couple of days at least for those symptoms to develop. So
when this news came out, I had the kinds of questions I've alluded to, like, so wait, does this mean Iran didn't take enough care to avoid, or was it blah? I wanted to know what the implications were for kind of A, what Iran's intentions were, and B, how close we came to war. Like, do we have to revise any of our thinking about that?
Right.
And Scott Simon spent the whole time interviewing doctors about, like, how will these people be, how will these 8 guys do? It's like, right. I'm sorry, with all due respect, look, I'm glad I'm not one of them. I'm sorry it happened to them, but there are like 8 concussions a second in America. I mean, this is not, it isn't the magnitude of the injury that's at stake here. And that was just.
It's more the implications of the showdown with Iran.
Yeah, that's what I wanted illuminated.
If one of those missiles had landed in a little different spot, we could be at war with Iran. Right.
So
now.
Do we have to revise? I mean, I would have liked just further elucidation of questions like, well, do we think Iran gave us warning, blah, 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 blah. Did we come closer to war than we thought? There are a lot of, maybe it's just me, but that's the kind of question I wanted answered. It certainly didn't seem to be worth spending much time exploring the prognosis for these 8 people. They have concussions.
Right.
We know what a concussion is. It's like, and maybe to get back to your point, go ahead.
Well, I mean, how many casualties have there been in Iraq and Iran? Non-fatal. I mean, Iraq and Afghanistan, like 250,000.
Oh yeah, most of them are more serious than many of them more serious than it's like losing limbs.
Yeah, and I mean, if you got off with a concussion, that's serious, but it could be worse.
But I think it seemed to me like an example of what I was talking about with Scott Simon of a kind of a. When he goes into sensitive mode.
Yeah, sort of let's talk about the human side of this and not the fact that we're maybe I'm reading too much into it. He does have that kind of sugary voice that makes it easy to read, the velvety voice that makes it easy to read sensitivity into him. But it's also part of my critique of NPR generally in foreign policy, partly because I just think concerns about getting emotive about the fate of people has, I think, often gotten us into trouble lately. It is used to get us into wars. Look at these suffering people that maybe we can help. Well, it almost always turns out we make things worse. Well, and like in Libya.
Yeah, Libya.
I mean, the whole justification for our intervention was that Gaddafi was going to carry out a genocide against the people of this one town, whose name I've forgotten. And it turns out that's
called Misrata or something, maybe.
Could
maybe
be.
Not.
And it turned out that the threat was not. He was not actually threatening that. And as you said, we intervened, and we saved those people, and we condemned Libya to what? How many has it been? 8 years of chaos.
Yeah. And now if we had confined our mission to actually protecting that one city, things might have been otherwise. The UN mandate specified that and then had this vague language that the Obama administration took advantage of to turn it into a regime change operation.
Yeah, it's kind of like, as long as they're over here, let's just go ahead and do some other stuff.
So I don't know if there are other complaints.
I mean, I think the episode you're talking about, I think there was an interest on the part of both the Trump administration, everybody in Congress, and Iran to go along with this pretense that the Iranians were not trying to kill Americans, and that's why they didn't. Because Trump didn't want to backtrack and say, oh, actually they were trying to kill us, so now we have to go after them. And the Iranians didn't want to say,
right,
don't let us off the hook because we were actually trying to kill you. We just didn't accomplish it.
Well, see,
so everybody kind of
what you just said itself would have been so much more illuminating than anything Scott Simon said, right?
Well,
I mean, that's what I mean. It seems to me when everybody's saying we're on the brink of war and then we don't have a war, at least yet, it's really worth ongoing analysis of why we did or didn't have a war.
Were we just lucky, or did people choose to do the right thing? Or
I mean, especially since I thought the whole possibility that Iran had very carefully avoided casualties was kind of underreported, and the possibility that they had alerted us to the missiles was underreported.
Except that Trump Trump made a big deal out of that. That was kind of, he seized on that to justify not doing anything in response.
Well, he seized on the fact that that's true. But on the other hand, the administration actually denies that Iran tipped them off.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, all that, I'd have loved to hear about that. In any event, what's the point of going into detail about the fact that the 8 people with concussions are probably going to be more or less fine? I'm sorry. I hate to sound like this hard-hearted person. So, now, what else should we talk about? Any other media stuff before? First of all, any other grievances against NPR?
No, I don't think so.
Sure now.
I mean, I would like to see more foreign coverage. I'd like to see them interview more people who have sort of unorthodox views on foreign policy. I think the sort of people who challenge kind of the whole basis of our sort of global mission rarely get heard. Yeah. If they do get heard at all, it's generally people from on the left rather than people who are sort of in favor of kind of a retrenchment and a more restrained, less interventionist foreign policy, but not an isolationist one. I mean, there's a very influential school of thought among international relations scholars called realism, which, rarely gets any attention. And they're mostly very skeptical about American military intervention in, crisis spots and most of what we do in the Middle East. And you rarely hear that on NPR.
Well, yeah, and it's an extension kind of what I was talking about, NPR's kind of touchy-feeliness, because realists get accused of being hard-hearted, the way I may be, because they're capable of saying things like, hey, sorry about the people who may be threatened in this one Libyan city, but, there are bigger issues at play. Now, my own view is that realism, many realist arguments actually are ultimately humanitarian in the sense that they're arguing that in the long term, you will do the most good for the most people by not intervening. But at the same time, there is often in realism, the need to explain why, notwithstanding the human suffering that it might seem like we could alleviate in the short run, we're not going to do anything. And I guess if you have any news network that makes a habit of illuminating the human suffering without bringing on the kinds of analysts who explain why we may need to resist the temptation to help these people, then you are, biasing your coverage on balance toward a kind of interventionism.
Right, that's true. Yeah, if you focus on the danger that's presented to people right now that you could potentially alleviate, and you're not interviewing the people 10 years in the future who are going to be suffering the consequences of all this, well, yeah, your bias is going to be for acting and not for restraining.
Yeah, I mean, a good proxy for those people 10 years from now would be a realist analyst, but they don't interview many realists.
No, they don't.
Because they take their cues from the blob, the foreign policy establishment, which has not welcomed realists.
Well, I mean, two of the most influential realist thinkers in the American Academy are John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt. I've never heard either of them interviewed on NPR. And I don't think it's just because they wrote a book about the Israel lobby, which, got them a lot of blowback. I mean, there are plenty of other realist scholars you could pick if you want to avoid those two, but I can't remember. I literally can't remember a single one who's ever been interviewed.
Well, it's funny.
Maybe Andrew Basevich.
Well, there is this new think tank in Washington. The first, I wouldn't say it's explicitly realist. It's explicitly restraint-oriented. It wants to be very cautious.
The John Quincy Institute?
The Quincy Institute. So right. Basevich is for now the president, although he's kind of temporary. We go not in search of monsters to destroy. That's their, That's their credo. Their epigram. And they have a little bit of a realist orientation. But, it's funny. I'm almost sure I am accurate in recalling in the run-up to the Iraq War, John Mearsheimer being on the PBS NewsHour, which was then probably called the Manila Report or something. And
I'm sorry, which Iraq war are we talking about?
Yeah, well, this is 2003. It's true that
Okay.
we've done more than one, but and he was, or maybe it was right after the invasion, and he was like confidently predicting disaster. He was like confidently predicting we're going to regret this. And he was doing it so confidently, I thought, although I was, publicly opposing the war, I thought that takes a lot of kind of nerve to make a prediction that strong. Now, fast forward to now. Do you see him? You would think that the people who got it right would get to go on CNN or go on NPR. Do you see him? No. Who do you see? You see almost without fail people who supported the war. Who's running the Atlantic? Jeffrey Goldberg. Who's,
who's writing for the Washington Post op-ed page? Max Boot.
Yeah. Rehabilitated via the resistance, but we needn't get into that.
Brett Stevens, for that matter.
Oh, please. Let's. This is starting to get painful. I mean, we're moving toward more and more nefarious people here.
But you're right. I can't think of anybody who was right on the war who has sort of been rewarded for being right, and there have been plenty of people who have been rewarded despite being wrong. In fact, it's the one sin in Washington. The one sin in Washington they can't forgive is being right. It's not being wrong.
Yeah, it really is an amazing fact, and it's much commented on. I mean, actually, Steve Walt wrote his last book partly about this, about why the foreign policy establishment is so screwed up, and he went into how.
The hell of good intentions?
Yeah, the hell of good intentions.
Yeah.
So now, did I first meet you at a lunch with Mike Kinsley?
Sounds plausible.
In Washington. Because
we've had such a long and happy association that I've forgotten where it began.
I think it was.
Probably when I was at the New Republic in the 78 to 81, I left.
I didn't realize you were actually at the New Republic. I was there from 88 to whatever, but you were, so that was after Marty bought it?
No, it was when Marty bought it, I think in 75, 76, something like that.
Yeah.
I got there in 78. Kinsley was running it at that point. He was sort of the managing editor.
That was before he went to Harper's. We should say for our younger folks, Mike Kinsley is I think the greatest editor of his generation. I mean, he turned the New Republic into, and this is back when, it was possible to talk about a magazine having tremendous importance. And certainly by the time I got there, the New Republic was, I think it's safe to say, the hottest magazine in Washington. And that was his doing. And
but he wasn't at the New Republic when you got there.
Yes, he was in 88. He hired me.
He had gone back.
Yeah, he went to Harper's. He edited Harper's, and then got fired by Robert MacArthur for departing from orthodoxy for not emoting enough about the possibility of nuclear holocaust. I think
he couldn't get along. Yeah, he couldn't get along with MacArthur.
Yeah,
and I think it was the piece he wrote about Jonathan Schell's book,
on
Fate
nuclear,
of the Earth.
Right,
yeah.
The Fate of the Earth about nuclear war.
And it was a hilarious takedown that Kinsley did, as all of his takedowns are.
Yeah, he is so amazing. And anyway, so if we are going to reminisce about media, I should tell you what happened to me yesterday. I was on Twitter. And there was all this discussion about the New York Times, the weird New York Times twin endorsement of, Warren and Klobuchar. And the Times had this video of the various interviews they've done with the candidates. Have you seen any of their kind of edited interview videos?
No.
Oh, they're interesting. I'll put off what I was going to say about the New Republic and the video of that I wound up watching for now. But, the videos are interesting. Well, let me just say this. Even though this is not going to run for a few days and the Times endorsement will be an old story by then, do you have a theory of that? It was an odd thing to do. Do you have a theory of why the Times did it?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, what's your theory?
My theory, and I've participated in a lot of editorial board meetings about endorsements.
Yeah.
So I'm drawing on that experience. And I'm not saying this has ever happened to us, but I think there's a temptation. There are two. I mean, I think what the Times had was a problem. They had a favorite candidate, which is Klobuchar, who they don't think has much of a chance of winning. And they have another candidate who's much more plausible, Elizabeth Warren. And I think they didn't want to run the risk of being irrelevant, to endorse Klobuchar, and a couple of weeks later she gets, basically wiped out in Iowa. Her candidacy is pretty much dead, and they're stuck with this endorsement, and what are they going to do? I think they wanted to kind of ensure that they would have some relevance to people's decisions. I mean, I can't justify it. I think it's a big mistake. It's not an easy decision to make when you have this many candidates, when you don't know how things are going to shake out when people actually start voting. But that's your job. Your job is to make a choice, tell voters who you think they should vote for. They can't vote for two people, so you need to give them one, and you need to make the case for why that's the best one. And you run the risk. Yeah, you do run the risk of you endorse Klobuchar, maybe you're going to look irrelevant. You endorse Warren, maybe you really are not entirely happy with the candidate you got, but man up and make your choice.
Yeah. I was kind of imagining a different scenario, that they did it almost by process of elimination. I mean, right before the day before they announced or something, I suddenly became sure they were going to endorse Elizabeth Warren. And for me, it was almost a process of elimination. And it had to do with the fact that the Times, I think their identity is a little wrapped up in identity politics. Sure. Does that make sense? Maybe more than, I don't know if it's any more than the Washington Post, but I think it is. And the videos that they did of interviewing the candidates are kind of relevant here. You should really watch one, because they make a point of, it's like one of those college videos where a college does the official video of its student body, and the diversity is striking. Whenever you see 7 people in a room, there's like an Asian American, it's like, it had some of that quality. I mean, I'm sure, it was the true Times editorial board, but anyway, it was, there seemed to be a lot of emphasis on showing us who the kind of editors are who are nodding thoughtfully. But anyway, I think also more specifically, the Times is pretty associated with the Me Too thing. I mean, they broke the big story, and they followed the story, and they disciplined a reporter who violated, and anyway, all of this led me to think, okay, it can't be Joe Biden, even though if you leave aside questions about his current cognitive capacity, he'd be fine with the Times ideologically, more or less, right?
Right, sure.
But it can't be him, because he's just such an old white male, right? It's just, the current New York Times cannot do him. So he's out of the way. Bernie Sanders is out of the way. So, and Biden's number 1 in the polls. Well, who's number 2? Bernie Sanders. Well, no, he's too far left for the Times. And besides, there had just been this spat between him and Elizabeth Warren that had Me Too overtones, in the sense of, are we going to believe the woman? Don't we always believe the woman? Are we going to disbelieve the woman? Are we going to side with the man? Right. I'm not sure the Times can be seen as siding with the man. So even if
and he is a white male.
He is another white male. And at that moment was locked in conflict with a female over a kind of a gender issue. He had allegedly said this, blah, 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 blah. So even if his ideology were not beyond the pale, which it just about is for the Times, I think, you'd have to rule him out. So he's gone. And then you get to Buttigieg, going down the pole. And I mean, come on, the guy is just a mayor of like a pretty small town, and that's it. And that has come to the fore about it. I think more and more people are realizing, like, wait a second, he made a first good impression, but seriously, I don't think they could be.
Yeah, if you were dean of admissions, you'd definitely take him, but he has no business in the presidency.
Right. And the Times it's inconsistent with the Times' sense of its own gravitas to endorse the mayor of South Bend for the presidency. So then we're down to Warren. And she's...
Well, Booker was still in the race at the time.
Was he?
Yeah. In fact, somebody who watched the sort of the final session where they actually cast their votes said that the four top candidates were Klobuchar, Warren, Booker, and I forget the other one. Maybe Bernie.
Well, you'd hope. But Booker is so low in the polls. I mean, you can't endorse a guy who's at 2%.
And then he withdrew before they endorsed.
So anyway, in my thinking, if they go down, if they just go in order of how they're polling and keep going down and just having to reject people, they have to reject these first three: Biden, Bernie, Buttigieg. They finally get down to Warren, and it's like, yeah, we could live with that. It's an identity politics endorsement. It's kind of implicitly a Me Too endorsement. I'm not saying they thought all of this, but I just mean, given what their identity is, they would be comfortable with that. And so why go lower? It turns out they did go lower and threw somebody else in as well. But
I think they probably did kind of have, consciously or not, a real desire to endorse either a minority or a woman. I don't think this was the year that they wanted to endorse an old white male.
Right. And the beauty of throwing Klobuchar is she's a woman. So it's like there's kind of a statement there implicitly that I think they're comfortable with making. Right.
What statement?
Well,
she's pragmatic.
No, I mean the statement, just being two women. The idea that their first two choices are women. I think at some level there is some real comfort with that idea at the Times. Is that
I'm assuming there are going to be two winners in the Super Bowl by decree of the New York Times.
I wouldn't bet on that. Anyway, quickly, it was a tweet in reference to the New York Times thing, linked to this C-SPAN. In 1986, C-SPAN had taped an editorial meeting of the New Republic. Have you ever seen this?
I don't think so.
It's worth it. It really. So I got there 18 months after this was done. I sat in on my first meeting.
So I don't get to see the youthful Bob Wright.
Yeah, I'm afraid not. I really
doing ideological battle.
I haven't changed. I would say if you saw a picture of me in 1988, you would not be able to tell the difference. I always looked like a 63-year-old man. Oh God, it was actually emotionally powerful for me because this was the room where I endlessly sat in on these meetings. And it was the same cast of characters. It was the same, almost all were the people who were there when I got there.
Really?
Yeah. And Mike Kinsley is like 35 or something at this
Charles
point.
Charles Krauthammer, Leon Wieseltier.
Leon, Mickey Kaus was there.
Oh, wow. I'd forgotten
Jacob
Mickey
Weisberg.
Right.
And Dorothy Wickenden, Ann Hulbert. It was just, I woke up twice last night thinking about this. It's like it's like I don't have much video from that time in my life.
Right.
And I certainly don't. How many of us, this was just a recreation of an important place. Right. I mean, for 7 months, I actually was acting editor when Mike was on sabbatical. So I was sitting in his chair for 7 months, and that was a high intensity part of my life. But anyway, it also just took me back to the days of old media, which brings us to the Wither the Newspaper segment that you're in charge of. Wither the Newspaper, Steve.
It's hard to be.
That's W-H-I. Whichever one doesn't mean wasting away is the one I mean. I forget how you spell the two, but I mean, where is the newspaper?
Yeah, it's obviously a tough environment for print newspapers. Our subscriber, the number of readers we have, the number of subscribers we have is, I think when I got to the Tribune in 1981, our Sunday circulation was 1.1 million. And it's probably, I haven't looked at the figures lately, but I would guess 250,000 now. the way we made money in the past was not on subscriptions. You mean the newspaper was pretty cheap. We delivered to, we would deliver to places at, 200 miles from Chicago. We couldn't have made money on that, but you wanted the circulation for the advertisers because where we made money was on help wanted ads, real estate ads, and car ads. Mm-hmm. And all those went away with the internet, and nobody buys a newspaper to find a house anymore, or an apartment, or a job. Rarely even a car. I mean, the Saturday papers usually have car ads, but there are not a lot of sort of classified ads. So we don't, all the money we used to make from advertising, not all of it, most of it's gone. So we have to make it up in subscribers, and at a time when we're losing subscribers because people can read the news, for free, in any number of sites. We should have had paywalls all along, I guess. But I don't think until everybody is doing it, it's very dangerous for anybody to do it.
Yeah. You're doing an impressive job of hanging on. I mean, like so many newspapers, your ownership changes, but you're now part of a chain. Right? The Tribune Company also is, or whatever it's called, owns the Baltimore Sun, the New York Daily News, right? Yeah,
we've always owned a bunch of papers, Baltimore Sun, the Orlando Sentinel, the Hartford Courant. I forget the others, and then we owned the Daily News, and we sold it to Mort Zuckerman, and then a few years ago we bought it back from whoever owned it then. So yeah, we've always had, I don't know, 10 or 12 papers in the group. And then we acquired the LA Times in mid 2000s, and then later sold them. They hated being part of the Tribune. Mm.
Yeah. So I guess the papers that seem to be making a go of it are basically the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. The most obvious, that are most clearly the big papers that are most right. clearly making a go of it, right? I mean, they've all probably to some extent become more than national newspapers, but certainly they're national. And maybe there's only so much room in that niche. And
the Wall Street Journal's always had the advantage that people in business have to read it. They can expense it, and they've always had a very affluent subscriber base, and they don't really care about the cost. And it was pretty easy for them to retain, to get digital subscribers to replace any print subscribers they lost. Yeah. The New York Times, nobody has the breadth of coverage, depth of coverage they have. That makes it, the problem is that, for most newspapers, what they offer, the news they offer is a commodity. It's not particularly distinctive. You can find out what Trump said, in any number of places. You don't have to subscribe to the Tribune to get it. If you want to read, the New York Times foreign correspondents, their coverage from Egypt or Paris or Hong Kong, you've got to buy the Times. Yeah. There are not many papers who can say that anymore.
Yeah. So what's your view on whether this is a horrible thing or not? In other words, do you see in Chicago, to the extent that the Tribune's resources don't permit it to do things it used to do, either in Chicago or in the larger world? I'm sure there was a time when the Tribune had a bunch of foreign correspondents.
Oh, yeah. We probably had 10 foreign bureaus when I got here. We probably had that many domestic bureaus, and we don't have any of those anymore.
Wow.
We don't even have a Washington bureau, I don't believe.
That's amazing.
And, we subscribe to the New York Times, their newswire, and we use some of their stories. We have AP stuff, but we don't have, we've cut staff, very dramatically in the last 10, 15 years. And there's just a lot of stuff we used to do that we don't do anymore.
So do you see these functions being fulfilled by someone else? And I don't just mean the ones you described, but, local coverage. Because there are people who say, yeah, the newspaper's dying, but, other things will do what the newspaper did. What's your take on that?
I think the news coverage suffers. I mean, I think you're better having, correspondence from 7 or 8 or 10 papers, news services covering events abroad or in Atlanta or San Francisco than if you have just 2 or 3. You're just going to get more viewpoints. You're going to find out things you wouldn't find otherwise, and I don't think anybody's really taking up the slack there. There's obviously a lot more commentary than there used to be. I mean, there's been just an explosion of commentary in the last 30 years. And so if that's what you want, then, you're living in a golden age. But I whether that's a good thing or not, I think there's probably, I think we probably have more commentary than we really need compared, relative to news coverage.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not talking about the Tribune. I'm talking about, print media in general.
Go ahead.
And I mean, the media in general.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. The New York Times, people think of the internet as having decentralized power in a lot of ways. All these things spring up. But in a certain sense, the New York Times' influence is greater in some ways than it used to be because, it always considered itself the paper of record, but now there are just fewer rivals, I guess, for that position. Now, at the same time, there are all these little websites that can challenge it around the fringes and so on. But, when people look for like a validator of a particular angle on a news story, like what is the real story here, there's just fewer sources to choose from. Do you think isn't that right?
Yeah. And I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah. Also, I got to say, I'm sorry that you're no longer in the building you were once in. I've been in the Chicago Tribune building.
You can buy a luxury condo there now if you really like the place.
Well, I don't know of any journalists who will be able to afford those, and that includes me. So you want to, in the time left, talk a little more about, unless you have something more to say about the state of media, do you have a grand theory or anything? Are you on balance down on this whole thing?
I'm not terribly optimistic. I think the Tribune does a lot with the resources we have now. I think, most newspapers do. They're still a vital institution in, almost every community. But they're not able to do as much as they used to be able to do. And the losses and the stories we don't see, we don't ever hear about.
Yeah. And you're saying that does include the local scene.
We focus, we're focused, mostly on local stories, state, regional stuff. Rather, we're not, our commentary, there's a lot of national commentary, but, our reporters we're almost entirely focused on.
Is that job being done as well as it was ever done, you think?
I think it is, yeah.
Oh, well, that's good.
I think there are probably fewer resources for that even, but, that's kind of the focus. And I think we've obviously we do a lot of great reporting at the local level.
Mm-hmm. So, you want to talk a little about politics? You had, in our exchange, you had mentioned among the things you were interested in was Bernie's chances in Iowa. Do you have a take on that, and Bernie's chances overall?
I'm not a fan of Bernie, and I have this sinking feeling he's going to win Iowa.
Yeah, but are you one of these people who always assumes that whatever you don't want to happen will happen?
And why would I be wrong to assume that, Bob, based on my experience?
Your entire life?
Yeah, my entire life. I think, what Bernie has going for him in Iowa is he's been there before. He's got a very enthusiastic set of voters. And in Iowa, it's really important the intensity of support, not just the breadth of support, because you got to get people to go out on a Monday night, middle of winter in Iowa. You may have to travel miles from their homes and spend several hours that they could be home watching a basketball game or knitting a sweater and, try to talk your, neighbors into voting for your candidate. And so it takes a big commitment. And I think the Bernie's people are more likely to have that commitment than anybody else who comes to mind, particularly Biden's. I mean, I think Biden's support is broader than Bernie's, but it's not as intense. And in Iowa, that can make all the difference. And, you know, people forget, I mean, who won the 1988 Republican caucuses in Iowa? Pat Robertson. What was that about?
That was about fervor. That makes your point.
It was about evangelical Christians who really got revved up to, you know, elect Pat Robertson. Yeah.
Now I do gather, I learned this from listening to the DMZ, a show on Blogging Heads with Matt Lewis and Bill Scher. Bill said that they have lowered the threshold to kind of participating in the political process. It's easier to do. I forget the details, but it takes slightly less strenuous effort to participate in the caucus than it did last time around.
Okay. Well, that's good to know.
Yeah, I thought that would cheer you up.
Well, maybe that'll help Biden. I'd prefer Biden to Bernie.
Yeah, but don't you worry honestly about what is your view on Biden's cognitive situation?
I think cognitively he's okay.
In what sense isn't he okay?
You know, I don't think you should, you know, as a rule, I don't think anybody much over 70 should be president, should be elected president. I just think that's too old. I'm on the record as saying that a long time ago, and I thought McCain was too old. And I think it's a mistake to elect somebody who's going to be 78 years old when he takes office. And there are bigger mistakes you could make. You know, there are worse candidates you could choose. I mean, I would rather take my chances with an old Biden than an old Bernie. I would probably rather take my chances with an old Biden than a somewhat younger Warren.
But that's ideological, right?
That's ideological, yeah. I mean, you know, if candidates who were otherwise the same, I would prefer a younger candidate to an older one. And
but I do think Bernie is sharper intellectually. And when I say cognitive, I don't mean that he has dementia or anything. I think, judging by the rate at which I'm slowing down, I will be, when I'm 78, if I'm alive at all, in no better shape than Biden's in. It's just that it's kind of like what you're saying. If you're in your late 70s and you're really going to be up to the demands, not just of being president, but participating in a 2 or 3 hour debate and various other things, you've got to be kind of exceptional. Now, I actually think Bernie is exceptional. I think he's, for his age, pretty damn sharp, not quite as sharp as he once was, maybe. But I think Biden has the thing about Biden is there's always been a kind of a diffuseness about him and a slightly erratic quality to his like train of thought. And maybe it's just that age magnifies that. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure he's any worse than he used to be. And I sort of think that Bernie's, what passes for his sort of cogency and mental acuity is just that he's so rigid and dogmatic that he doesn't really have to sort through a lot of information to figure out what he thinks. Where I think Biden actually, you know, there's more thinking going on in Biden's brain than there is in Bernie's.
The charitable way to put that would be to say that Bernie has firm convictions, but I don't suppose you want to put it that way.
He definitely has firm convictions, but you know, any virtue can be carried to an extent that it becomes a fault.
Yeah, I like Bernie, and I mean, I'm certainly not as far left as he is on domestic policy. I think he's more likely to do good on the foreign policy front than most or all of them. And on the domestic policy front, let's face it, he's not going to get a lot of this stuff through Congress. It's not like it's not like you have to realistically worry about 2 years from now, Americans not having the ability to hang on to their private health insurance and having to sign on to Medicare for all. I just don't see that politically in the cards.
Yeah, I mean, but the second worst thing that could happen if Bernie's nominated is that he wins. The worst thing that could happen is that he loses, and I think he would have a much harder time winning an election than some of the other candidates.
Wait, say that again. I'm not sure I followed that.
I think I don't think he would be a strong candidate against Trump. I think compared to other candidates, he would be I don't think it's hard to run against a socialist in America.
My view on that is that in many ways he is well positioned to run against Trump. First of all, he has some of what Trump had, but for very different reasons. Trump supporters look at Trump and go, well, he's not another fake politician. And the evidence is he's always saying this crazy shit that real politicians don't say.
Right.
Bernie, I think a lot of people react to rightly the same way. He's not just another fake politician. As you said, he has convictions, and it shows. It shows. Mm-hmm. He's not sitting up there calculating like what he thinks you want him to say. And I think that appeals to a lot of people. Ideologically, he has something in common with Trump. He's an economic nationalist. Foreign policy, he sounds a little like Trump sounds, although Trump doesn't always act the way he sounds on foreign policy. So I think that part is okay. And I think, God, in these days, I'm not sure the label socialist is a killer. What I think is a killer for Bernie in the general, if he doesn't change this, is what I alluded to. If he sticks with his healthcare proposal to the even to the point of saying you will have to give up your private health insurance, I think that's a killer. If they can run the attack ad that says he will make you give up your private health insurance, even if you like it, for an untested program.
And he will raise your taxes to do it because he, unlike Warren, has acknowledged that.
Yeah, that could hurt too. But I just think having to give up your insurance is just I think that in itself is a poison pill. And he probably wouldn't change that, so maybe he is toast in the general. But
my view of people's view, my view of the general American attitude about healthcare is we hate what we have, and you better not change it.
Yeah, except make it cheaper.
We assume we assume that any change is going to be a bad one.
Yeah. No, I think even Obamacare, which is relatively modest, ran into that concern. So who do you think is the strongest candidate against Trump? You think Biden is?
I think Biden would be a pretty strong candidate, yeah. I think Klobuchar would be a good candidate.
I guess. I don't know. She's got to do something about the shaking hair, though, don't you think?
I've never noticed it. I've heard people mention it. But
it's all I see when she talks.
Shaking
It's gotten
hair?
better. In the last debate, the shake had been reduced by, 10, 20%. She's definitely working on it.
Whatever hairspray you use that keeps your hair from shaking, I think you need to send her a can.
Have you noticed that mine hasn't shaken the whole time?
It does not shake. Mine doesn't either.
My hair is buttery soft.
Oh, well, my scalp is buttery soft.
Well, I guess we've reached the point we can end on. Anything else you want to say about anything?
No, we didn't get to talk about the Astros.
Well, bring it on. Houston Astros, cheaters never win, but they did win the World Series while cheating.
But they're disgraced, and there's going to be a taint attached to that name for the rest of as long as the franchise is in existence.
And what about those Patriots? Do you think it's tainted them, the various forms of cheating they've engaged in?
Well,
Bill Belichick?
It was bad, but, I don't know that it was quite as bad. And it wasn't something the whole team knew about.
Well, okay.
Like the use of, like the deflated footballs.
Yeah, but also they did do something a little more now. The Astros, for people who haven't been paying attention, if you're not baseball fans, you should know that catchers send signals to pitchers about which pitch to throw next. If you're the batter.
Using fingers.
And if
1, 2, 3 fingers.
If you're and here's what's funny. It's considered legit. Like if the offensive team has a runner on second who can pick up on the signals and somehow relay them to the batter, that's considered legit.
Right.
What's not considered legit is to use technology, have a camera in your home stadium so that every visiting team is subject to a CIA level analysis of their signaling system, and you somehow relay that to the batter, which they did in this case by banging on a trash can, moving from high tech to low. That's considered
can't get much lower tech than that.
That's considered not legit. Although we now know that one of the most famous home runs in the history of baseball, shot heard around the world, in either 51
yeah.
or 53.
That was a guy with binoculars and
that was abetted by
the signs to the batter.
A guy in the center field.
You've frozen on me, so
yeah.
Are you there?
I
can't hear you.
You can't hear me. Yeah. So
now I can hear you.
Now you can hear me. And the virtue of your recording this locally and my recording it locally is that this will all work out. People will be able to hear everything we said, including "Can you hear me?" So anyway, you're down on the Astros.
I'm down on the Astros, and I'm down on Jessica Mendoza, who was one of my favorite sportscasters since she started doing ESPN Sunday Night Baseball. She was the first woman they'd had, on Sunday Night Baseball. They were part of the regular baseball broadcast. And
wait, you're going to complain about the woman who broke the gender barrier in like ESPN baseball?
Well,
Sunday Night Baseball?
it's the people you admire who disappoint you, who you have the strongest feelings about, right? I mean, Alex Rodriguez was in the booth last season, and I can't stand him. Can't stand him on any number of levels, but I never felt disillusioned by Alex Rodriguez because I never admired him.
You never thought he wasn't using steroids in the first place?
No, I always thought he was a bad guy. And Jessica Mendoza, I had very high opinion of, and she actually attacked the Oakland A's pitcher who broke the story, who told a couple of reporters about when he had been on the Astros, what they were doing, because he decided, this needs to come out. It's not legitimate the way they're conducting themselves, and somebody needs to, uncover the truth. And instead of trashing the Astros for cheating, she trashed Mike Fiers for revealing that they were cheating. And I just thought,
you will not forgive her.
Not without some contrition on her part.
Has she sought your forgiveness? Has she
No,
called
she's
you?
not. She did issue a statement which was kind of a mealy-mouthed, yes, I'm against cheating in baseball. I just wish it had come about in a different way. Anyway, it was pretty pathetic. She also is, has some sort of affiliation with the New York Mets. She's some sort of advisor, which is kind of an odd thing for an ESPN broadcaster to do, and sort of dubious on its face. But so that may have been, part of her motive. I don't know. It was disappointing.
And was the whistleblower, you think he was motivated by high-minded ideals?
Well, I don't know. Maybe
it wasn't some petty grievance. I mean, don't you think it's possible there were people that he had not liked when he was at the Astros?
Oh, sure. I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
But nobody else had the nerve to reveal it, and he did. And, whatever his motives, that took some courage. And I'm sure he'll get some grief from his fellow players, on other teams, if not his.
Yeah. Well, that's the price you pay if you're a whistleblower, and you can't just and you can't maintain your anonymity. My wife and I just saw a really interesting play that's no longer running in New York called "Is This a Room?" Have you ever heard about this? They took Reality Winner, the whistleblower, who got sentenced to 5 years in jail, leaked the thing to The Intercept. The FBI had recorded her interrogation, which they did at her house. They just showed up and said, "Hey, we have a search warrant." She's freaking out. They did the interrogation there. And she, took, I don't know how long, within half an hour or so, she had caved and admitted she did it. They did a play that consists of it's completely faithful to the tape recording of this, down to the last cough and stammer.
Really? Wow. Yeah.
And now they took liberties in terms of where the people were. It would have been a little too boring to have them just sitting on the floor, which they were, because oddly, she has no furniture in her house. But so people kind of walked around, and that was a little stylized, but it was just fascinating to me because you knew it was all true. This was exactly how it proceeded. These were exactly the techniques they used to break her down. And it was just so sad.
I'd love to see it.
It was great. Unfortunately, that was the final performance. So I guess
maybe
they should revive
some
it.
Chicago theater will revive it.
It was packed. I mean, small house, but and it got great reviews. So maybe there's a video of it or something. There should be.
Chicago has a fabulous theater scene, so I'm sure somebody will do it.
I love Chicago. I've been there only a few times, but I just like the vibe.
Well, you're welcome anytime.
Okay, I will remember that. And you're welcome in central New Jersey. Let's see which of us is better able to resist the temptation.
Where is central New Jersey?
I live in a college town. I live in Princeton.
Oh, okay. All right. I have a colleague who's from Paramus.
One of my best friends is from Paramus, David Yellen. They have an excellent shopping mall there.
It's the hometown of former world champion figure skater Elaine Zayak.
Is that right?
Who was known as the Pride of Paramus.
Good trivia question. Who was known? Pride for 100. So I'll try not to forget that. So thank you so much, Steve. Tell us where we can. Now, one place we could try to find your work is at Chicago Tribune. As it happens, you have a little bit of a paywall there, right? It's not that easy to get.
We do.
So people should sign up. They should support.
People should subscribe.
Good journalism. Subscribe, and then they can have a peek at your oeuvre.
You should.
They can also follow you on Twitter. Where?
Steve Chapman 13.
Okay, that's straightforward enough. Any place else they should go?
I'm syndicated, and I don't know.
So they can sneak around the paywall.
Well, 30 or 40 papers. I don't know how many of them have a paywall. Probably most of them do. Yeah, but
there's probably a way we can get around this.
Well, they can Google it.
You can Google it, but again, you should sign up. You should pay the Chicago Tribune money so that people like you can remain gainfully employed. Well, thanks a lot. I hope we'll do this again when the world needs it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great fun.
Yeah, it was.